Flight attendant slaps black pregnant woman, then she makes one call and the plane is grounded. She boarded quietly. No makeup, no fancy clothes, just a pregnant woman trying to get through her flight. When she politely asked for help, the flight attendant rolled her eyes, spoke to her like she was nothing, and made her a public example. Robert Hayes looked away. No one helped. But what they didn't know was that the woman they all ignored had more power than anyone on that plane. And when she made one silent call, the plane didn't just stop. The airline was forced to answer for everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Ella boarded the plane slowly, one hand supporting her lower back, the other gripping the handle of her small carry-on. She was 7 months pregnant, moving carefully down the aisle, trying not to draw attention. Her belly was round and noticeable under her pale blue sweater. She had flown before during this pregnancy, but this time she felt more nervous, not because of the flight, but because this was the first time flying without her husband. She finally reached her seat in the business class section and smiled with relief. She had requested this seat weeks in advance, not because of the class, but because it was near the front of the cabin and close to help if needed. She had also paid extra to ensure assistance with lifting her bag, something her doctor had strongly advised against doing herself. Ella settled in gently, breathing out through her nose. The pain in her back eased slightly. She placed a water bottle and a small pouch of snacks on the tray table and rested her head. The cabin slowly filled with other passengers. Some gave her a kind smile. Others barely noticed her. A few minutes later, the head flight attendant walked by. Her name tag read Claire. She was tall, sharply dressed, and walked with fast, confident steps. She passed by Ella once, then stopped and looked back. Her eyes scanned Ella's belly, then narrowed slightly. "Excuse me," Claire said, folding her arms. "Did someone already help you with your bag?" Ella Sanrayo, educant. "No, not yet. The agent at the gate said someone from the crew would assist." Claire tilted her head. "That's not part of our job. You should have arranged for a medical assistant if you can't lift your own things." Ella's smile faded. "I requested help when I booked. It's part of your special care policy." Claire's lips tightened. "That policy is for actual medical conditions, not for people who just don't want to carry things." The words landed heavy. Ella blinked, unsure how to respond. She didn't want to make a scene. She just wanted to avoid any injury. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said gently. "It's just a small bag, and I was told someone would help me with it." Claire sighed loudly and muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." She reached up and shoved the bag into the overhead bin carelessly, almost slamming the door shut. Then, without looking back, she walked away. Ella sat in silence. Her cheeks were red. A few nearby passengers had seen what happened, but none of them said anything. One woman across the aisle looked over, but quickly turned away. Ella slowly pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook slightly as she typed a message. "Crew refused help. Attendant was rude. Tossed my bag like it was trash. I'm okay, just upset." She hit send. The reply came seconds later. "I'm calling the airline right now. Stay calm. Don't say anything else." Ella locked her phone and set it down on the tray. Her hand returned to her belly. The baby kicked again, this time harder. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself. She wasn't going to cry. Not yet. Because even though the flight had just begun, it was already headed somewhere no one was expecting. The engines hummed softly beneath the floor as final passengers took their seats. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, smiling at some, brushing past others. Claire didn't return to Ella's row, and that was fine by her. Ella stayed quiet, hands folded on her stomach, her breathing slow and steady. But inside, she wasn't calm. Her thoughts raced, replaying the way Claire had dismissed her, the way her belly had been ignored, the way the overhead bin had slammed shut like she wasn't even there. The passenger in the seat beside her, a middle-aged man with gray hair and expensive shoes, glanced her way. He opened his mouth for a moment as if to speak, but then looked away. Ella noticed. She noticed all of it. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She checked it discreetly. A message. "I spoke to their emergency operations team. They're contacting the crew right now. Just stay put." She blinked at the words. Her husband wasn't angry, He was never loud, but when he used that tone, even through a text, she knew he meant business. At the front of the plane, Claire stood by the galley laughing lightly with a younger attendant named Ava Thompson. Ava Thompson had been watching everything quietly. Her tone wasn't as bright as Claire's. "You were kind of rough with that lady, weren't you?" Ava Thompson asked gently. Claire rolled her eyes. "I'm not a nurse. She should have booked wheelchair service if she needed help." Ava Thompson didn't answer. She turned away to check her supply tray. Claire leaned back and took a sip of her coffee, still completely unaware that her morning was about to change. Back in the cabin, Ella shifted in her seat. Her lower back ached and her body felt tense. She leaned forward slightly, adjusting her posture. The man beside her cleared his throat. "I saw what happened earlier," he said, not making eye contact. "That was a bit harsh." Ella looked at him. "Yes, it was." He nodded once and looked away again. No apology, no support, just that weak, unsure comment. A few rows behind, a young couple whispered to each other. Ella couldn't hear the words, but she could feel their eyes on her. The look wasn't sympathy. It was discomfort, like she had made them uneasy just by being there. She picked up her phone again and opened the last message. She reread it slowly. Just stay put. That's what she planned to do. But in her gut, she knew something bigger was already moving. She could feel it in the air, and soon Claire would feel it too. Claire's confidence hadn't slipped, not even a little. She moved through the cabin with the air of someone who believed she knew exactly who mattered and who didn't. When she passed Ella's row again, she didn't make eye contact. She spoke to the man seated beside her instead, asking if he needed a drink before takeoff. Ella no fue ofrecida nada, ni siquiera una mirada. Ava Thompson, walking behind her with a tray of water bottles, hesitated for half a second near Ella's seat. She looked down, made brief eye contact, and gave the smallest nod. No words, just something soft in her eyes. Then she kept walking. Ella no se sorprendió. She had experienced this kind of treatment before. Quiet disrespect, the kind that didn't make headlines or earn apologies, the kind that sat in silence, unnoticed by everyone except the person it was aimed at. Up front, the cockpit phone buzzed. The captain, a man with years of calm experience in his voice, answered. A moment later, his expression changed. He leaned back slightly in his seat, listening carefully. "Yes, sir. Understood," he said, nodding slowly. "We'll hold for further instruction." He hung up and pressed a button, calling the head attendant. Claire stepped into the cockpit a moment later, her brow furrowed. "Everything all right?" she asked. The captain looked at her carefully. "We've received a directive from corporate. There's a concern regarding a passenger interaction in your cabin. They want clarification before we depart." Claire's posture stiffened. "What kind of concern?" "They didn't say exactly, just that it involves your behavior toward a passenger with medical clearance." Claire scoffed. "If this is about the pregnant woman, I was following basic safety protocol. She looked like she needed assistance, but didn't arrange it properly. I didn't do anything wrong." The captain didn't argue. He just picked up the phone again. "You might want to think carefully before you give your explanation to the ground manager. They're on the line now." Back in the cabin, the lights flickered slightly as the delay stretched longer than usual. Ella noticed the tension. Other passengers started whispering. A businessman in the front row glanced toward the galley, looking confused. Ella sus manando suavemente. Her water bottle sat unopened on the tray table. Her phone buzzed once more. "They're freezing the takeoff. I think they're going to address it before the plane moves." She closed her eyes and let the words sink in. Not out of relief, but because it confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't going to be brushed aside. Not this time. Claire stepped out of the cockpit with a tighter face than before. Her stride had lost some of its sharpness. She didn't say anything as she walked past the first few rows, but her fingers were twitching at her sides. Something had changed, and even the passengers could feel it. The cheerful boarding announcements had stopped. The flight hadn't pushed back yet. The delay was no longer casual. Ava Thompson stood near the galley, quietly organizing napkins. Claire approached her and leaned in close. "They're questioning my conduct over a simple request," she said in a low voice, still trying to sound in control. "Apparently, someone didn't like how I handled the pregnant woman." Ava Thompson looked up, her voice calm. Did they ask for your version? Claire narrowed her eyes. Yes, and I told them exactly what happened. She wanted special treatment. I didn't have time to baby her. Ava Thompson didn't respond. She picked up a tray and turned away, but Claire followed. What? Claire asked sharply. You think I did something wrong? Ava Thompson didn't turn around. It's not about what I think. In business class, Ella felt the change. The whispering had grown louder. A man a few rows up stood and opened the overhead bin, clearly impatient. A woman nearby pressed her call button, then canceled it just seconds later. No one knew what was going on, but they all sensed it wasn't normal. Ella sat still. She didn't fidget. She didn't reach for her phone. She just waited. The baby shifted inside her. She placed her hand on her belly, calm and silent. Finally, the intercom crackled. The captain's voice came over the speaker, steady but formal. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to pause departure due to an internal matter. We appreciate your patience. Our team is working to resolve it quickly. Claire flinched slightly at the sound of it. She glanced back at the cabin. All eyes were shifting now, some toward her, others toward Ella. Ella no muyo. She kept her gaze forward. She didn't need to explain anything. She knew the truth. And now so did the airline. The silence inside the cabin grew heavier with each passing minute. Robert Hayes were no longer casually chatting or flipping through magazines. They were tense, whispering behind raised hands, exchanging glances toward the front of the plane. Something was clearly wrong, and everyone could feel it. But no one knew exactly what, only that the plane hadn't moved an inch, and the crew had gone unusually quiet. Ella remained seated, calm on the outside, but inside her heartbeat was strong and steady with purpose. She had said nothing. She had made no scene, and still everything had shifted. That alone told her something important. This wasn't going to be ignored. Up front, the cockpit phone buzzed again. The captain picked it up, and this time his eyes widened slightly at the voice on the other end. It wasn't the operations assistant or a crew scheduler. It was someone much higher, someone whose voice carried weight even over a crackling connection. I understand, the captain said after a few moments of listening. Yes, I'll inform her now. He hung up and turned toward the door, calling Claire once again. She stepped inside with a quick nod, trying to hide her nerves. They've escalated it, he said plainly. You're being asked to personally speak with a senior director of flight operations now? Claire blinked. A director? The captain didn't look amused. Apparently, the passenger involved has connections at the executive level. Claire crossed her arms. Of course she does, she muttered under her breath. The captain stared at her. This isn't a joke, Claire. They've halted this aircraft on her behalf. That doesn't happen for just anyone. They're watching how you respond now. Claire didn't reply. She just turned sharply and walked back into the cabin, her shoulders straighter than before, but her face slightly pale. She paused near the galley and looked toward Ella's seat for the first time in over 20 minutes. Ella looked back, steady and unreadable. Claire took a breath, stepped forward, and crouched slightly beside Ella's row. Her voice was lower now, controlled, too controlled. Ma'am, she began, forcing a small smile. I'd like to clear up a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to come across as disrespectful earlier. We've just been under a lot of pressure. And Ella raised her hand gently, stopping her. She didn't speak right away. She studied Claire's face, the nervous tension around her mouth, the stiffness in her eyes. I didn't ask for anything out of the ordinary, Ella said softly. You were just the one who decided I didn't deserve basic kindness. Claire swallowed. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said, Ella replied, still calm. You made a choice, and now someone else is making one too. Robert Hayes nearby listened quietly. One woman stared over the top of her sunglasses. A man next to the aisle subtly pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages, but recording instead. Claire stood slowly, her lips tight. She gave a stiff nod and walked back toward the front of the cabin. Inside the galley, she leaned against the counter, trying to collect herself. Mia stood nearby, wiping a tray. They asked for a statement, didn't they? Ava Thompson asked. Claire didn't answer. Did you tell the truth? Mia added without looking at her. Claire turned her head. I told them what they needed to hear. Mia finally looked up. Number. You told them what you thought would protect you. Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. She was starting to realize this wasn't just about a single moment anymore. It was about everything that came after. Ella shifted slightly in her seat, her back aching from sitting still for so long. The tension hadn't left the air. It had only thickened. Around her, passengers were becoming restless. Some began pressing their call buttons. Others sighed loudly or stood to stretch. But no one asked her what was going on. They all knew in their own way. They had seen it. They had heard Claire's tone. They had watched her ignore, dismiss, and humiliate a woman who had done nothing more than ask for what she was told she was entitled to. Help. Ella reached into her bag and took out a small packet of crackers, the only thing she could manage to stomach. With the nerves in her chest, her phone buzzed again. This time the message was short, and it made her stomach turn, but not from worry. They've grounded the flight for you. She blinked at the words, letting them settle in her mind. The plane hadn't moved because someone finally said enough. Not because she shouted, not because she fought, but because someone in a high place knew what was right and saw what was wrong. At the front of the aircraft, the tension inside the galley was now palpable. Claire stood with her arms crossed, her posture no longer confident, but defensive. Ava Thompson stood a few feet away, silent but watchful. The phone beside the sink buzzed again, and Claire flinched. She answered it with a shaky hand. Claire speaking. The voice on the other end was firm, not cruel, not angry, but disappointed in a way that hit deeper than yelling ever could. This is Director Michael Reed. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want the truth. Did you or did you not refuse to assist a medically cleared pregnant passenger when she requested help and then dismiss her with inappropriate remarks? Claire's mouth went dry. There was miscommunication. She didn't request special handling when she booked. That's not what I asked. Claire hesitated. She could feel Ava Thompson's eyes on her, could feel the walls closing in. I refused to help her. Yes, I told her it wasn't part of our job, but I didn't mean to insult her. The silence on the other end was long. You know, her husband is on the board. The voice finally said, Don't you? Claire's throat tightened. No, I didn't. Well, now you do. And he's not asking for a quiet apology. He's asking for accountability, the kind we can't ignore. Claire gripped the phone tighter, but her knees were starting to shake. What does that mean? It means the plane is grounded. You'll be removed before this flight continues. Security will escort you from the aircraft. You're suspended, effective immediately. Claire's breath caught in her chest. Suspended. Pending investigation, the voice confirmed. You can explain yourself to the ethics board after we've spoken to the other crew and passengers, but your part in this flight is over. The line went dead. Claire slowly set the phone down, her hand trembling. She turned to Ava Thompson, who had gone still as a statue. You heard all that, didn't you? Claire whispered. Mia nodded slowly. Every word. Claire sank into the jump seat, her legs unable to hold her anymore. For the first time in her career, she was being taken off a flight, not for illness, not for emergency, but for failing to treat someone like a human being. Back in the cabin, Ella sipped her water calmly. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't satisfied, but her eyes were clear and her spine was straight. Robert Hayes around her began to buzz with more energy. The news had started to spread. The plane was grounded and no one knew why, but Ella knew. And in just a few minutes, so would everyone else. The captain stepped out of the cockpit and walked down the aisle, his expression calm but purposeful. His presence caught the attention of almost everyone in the business class cabin. Conversations hushed, heads turned. This wasn't something passengers saw every day. A captain, mid-flight prep, walking into the cabin instead of making announcements from behind the door. He stopped just a few rows short of Ella's seat, not close enough to make her feel cornered, but close enough to be clear. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice steady and respectful, I want to thank you for your patience during this delay. We've encountered an internal issue involving the conduct of a crew member, and to ensure the safety and dignity of all our passengers, we are resolving it before takeoff. Murmurs rose at once. Several people exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others leaned forward with interest. The captain continued. At this time, A flight attendant will be deboarding the aircraft and a replacement will join us shortly. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your understanding. He gave a slight nod, then turned and walked back toward the front. The announcement was brief, controlled, and said everything without naming names. But everyone knew. The shift in the cabin was immediate. Claire stood stiffly by the galley, her hands clenched behind her back. She had heard the announcement. She had seen the glances and she felt the eyes pressing against her like heat through glass. The door of the aircraft opened. A ramp agent stepped on board, followed by a uniformed security officer in a navy jacket with a company badge on his chest. The cabin fell into a strange, stunned silence. Claire didn't wait to be asked. She stepped forward and nodded silently to the officer. Her face was pale, her posture still proud, but fragile now, like a cracked shell. She turned toward the cabin. Her voice when she finally spoke was quiet but forced. "I'll be stepping off the flight. Thank you all." No one responded, not a single passenger. Even Ava Thompson remained silent, her hands folded at her waist. As Claire walked down the aisle, Ella turned her head slowly to meet her eyes. There was no anger on her face, no smugness, just calm, an unshakable calm that made Claire stop for half a second. "I'm sorry," Claire said softly. "I shouldn't have treated you that way." "Ella no parpadio." "I know." The words were light, but their weight was crushing. Claire nodded once, then turned and walked off the plane, escorted by the officer. As the door shut behind them, the tension lifted, slowly. Carefully, a wave of quiet disbelief swept through the passengers. A woman across the aisle leaned toward Ella. Her voice was hushed. "Did that really just happen?" Ella gave a small nod. The woman stared at her for a moment, then looked down. "I should have said something earlier." Ella, no respondio. She didn't need to. She had already said more by saying nothing at all. Moments later, Ava Thompson stepped forward and addressed the cabin. Her voice was soft but firmer than before. "We'll be departing shortly. A new lead attendant is on the way. If anyone needs anything in the meantime, I'm here." She looked at Ella, then really looked at her. "I apologize for what happened earlier," she added, her voice no longer rehearsed or robotic. "It wasn't right." Ella offered a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't dismissal. It was simply acknowledgement. As Ava Thompson returned to her duties, passengers slowly relaxed back into their seats. But the mood had changed permanently. The quiet had become something else now. Respect, recognition, accountability. Ella picked up her phone again and saw a new message waiting. "She's off the flight. You did good. You didn't even have to raise your voice." She stared at the message for a moment, then locked the screen and tucked it away. Because the truth was she hadn't done anything but sit quietly, ask for what she was promised, and refuse to shrink when someone decided she didn't belong. And sometimes that was the loudest thing a person could do. The new lead flight attendant arrived 10 minutes later, an older woman named Margaret, who carried herself with quiet confidence and no unnecessary cheer. She walked through the cabin with steady eyes, offering nods and short greetings, making it clear that this flight was going to be handled differently now. Robert Hayes had settled down, but the tension hadn't vanished completely. They were processing what had just happened. Some whispered quietly to seatmates, others avoided eye contact altogether, unsure how to feel about witnessing something they hadn't tried to stop. Ella remained still in her seat, her hands resting on her stomach. She hadn't said much since Claire was removed, but her silence had power now. Real, undeniable power. The same people who had once ignored her were now looking at her differently. They weren't sure how to approach her, or if they even should. Across the aisle, the same man who had earlier offered her a half-hearted comment was now sitting up straighter. He opened his mouth as if to say something again, but this time Ella didn't meet his eyes. She wasn't interested in polite guilt. She didn't want anyone's sympathy. She had already carried the weight of being invisible until she couldn't be ignored. The intercom clicked on again, and the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We'll be pushing back in a few minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your devices are in airplane mode." The aircraft began to hum with movement. The plane backed away from the gate slower than usual, as if even the metal frame could feel the shift in atmosphere. Margaret came down the aisle checking on passengers. When she reached Ella, she stopped, knelt slightly and looked her in the eye. "I was briefed," she said gently. "I want you to know that what happened should never have happened, and it won't be ignored." Ella studied her for a moment before nodding once. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't need to. The look in Joanne's eyes was enough. Respect without pity. That was all she ever wanted. As Margaret moved on, a younger woman in the row behind leaned forward. She looked nervous, her hands wringing in her lap. I wanted to say I saw everything," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do." Ella turned slightly. "You didn't have to do anything, but now you've seen it. You'll notice it next time. That matters." The woman blinked, surprised. She gave a small, grateful nod before sitting back again. The plane taxied slowly, the lights of the runway stretching out in glowing lines ahead. Night had begun to fall outside, casting long shadows across the cabin. Ella looked out the window, her reflection faint against the darkening glass. She didn't see a victim. She didn't see someone who had caused trouble or asked for too much. She saw someone who had been underestimated and who held her ground. Far ahead in the first row, Ava Thompson stood near the bulkhead, watching the cabin from her quiet corner. Her eyes met Ellis again for a brief second. She didn't look away. In that moment, there was no need for words. Ava Thompson had witnessed how quickly things could shift when someone simply refused to stay silent. And now she was seeing what quiet strength looked like when it was backed by truth and power. The engines roared to life. The aircraft lifted into the sky, and still no one said her name. No one stood and clapped. No one turned this into a grand event. But everyone on that flight would remember what had happened because nothing had exploded. No voices were raised. No laws were broken. Just one woman asking for help and one flight attendant who decided she didn't deserve it. That decision had grounded a plane, removed a tenure crew member, and changed the tone of the entire airline for the rest of the night. And now the flight had taken off, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. The sky outside was quiet. Inside the cabin, the truth had already landed. The flight moved forward, quiet but charged. At cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began shifting again, reaching for tablets, adjusting pillows, trying to act like things were normal. But the atmosphere hadn't returned to what it was before. It couldn't. The events that unfolded on the ground had cracked something open. No one could pretend it hadn't happened. No one could unsee what they saw. Ella reclined her seat just a little, careful of her back. Her body felt heavy, not from the baby, but from the emotional weight she had carried in silence. She wasn't tired exactly, but there was a kind of exhaustion that settled in after you spend too much time proving your existence. She looked around. The quiet glances were still there. Some were curious, some were unsure, and some were filled with quiet respect. A flight attendant she hadn't seen before, a man with a kind face and soft voice, walked up to her seat holding a silver tray. "We're serving refreshments now. May I offer you anything?" he asked. Ella looked up, surprised by the warmth in his tone. It wasn't forced. It wasn't part of some customer service script. It was real. "Sparkling water," she said softly. "If you have it." He smiled and poured it into a glass. "Of course, I'll also bring you a warmed blanket, and if you need to lie back or stretch, let us know. We'll do everything we can to make the rest of this flight comfortable." Ella nodded, watching him walk away, and for the first time that day, she let herself exhale in full, not because she felt satisfied or triumphant, but because, for once, the care being offered wasn't a favor. It was simply how things should have been all along. As she sipped the cold water, the older woman too rose up, turned slightly in her seat. She wore a tan blazer and had been silent the entire flight. Now she gave Ella a faint smile and said, "You handled that with grace. I just wanted to say that." Ella gave a polite nod. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, then added, "I've seen things like that before. I've never seen anyone get held accountable for it, though." Ella no respondió de inmediato. Then she said, "That's why they keep doing it." The woman nodded slowly and turned back around, visibly processing the truth of that statement. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain spoke quietly with ground control through his headset. He had filed an official mid-air report documenting the incident with the removed crew member. It wasn't standard procedure to do it during flight, but nothing about this flight had been standard. Yes, I've confirmed she was escorted off before pushback, he said. Robert Hayes involved remains calm. No disturbance. All crew currently cooperative. He paused, listening. Understood, he said. Yes, I'll notify her husband after landing. He'll be meeting her at the gate personally. Back in the cabin, Ella rested her head against the window for a moment, the glass cool against her skin. Her phone was in airplane mode, but her mind replayed the last few hours in clear, heavy detail. The insult, the dismissal, the slap of words more painful than a physical blow. The way no one stood up at first, the moment the entire flight shifted without her ever raising her voice. She hadn't needed to. She had said enough with her silence. Now others were doing the talking. Robert Hayes, crew, senior management, her husband, and Claire. She was probably still trying to process what had happened, how a small, quiet act of disrespect could unravel an entire career in less than an hour. The baby was active, moving again. She smiled faintly, not because of what had happened, but in spite of it. Her child would grow up in a world where dignity sometimes had to be defended, without words. And now, at least on this one flight, that lesson had been written into the air quietly, clearly, and permanently. Far above the clouds, justice had already touched down. As the flight progressed, the cabin slowly adjusted to the new rhythm. Though an invisible line still separated the first half of the journey from the second, it was as if the aircraft itself remembered. The conversations were softer, the movement slower. Even the clinking of drink glasses and cutlery came with less energy, like the crew and passengers alike were moving through a space that had just witnessed something personal. Ella sat quietly, occasionally shifting in her seat to ease the pressure on her back. The sparkling water was half finished, condensation dripping slowly down the side of the glass. Her meal tray remained untouched. She wasn't hungry, not after the way everything had unfolded. The new lead attendant, Margaret, returned with a light blanket and carefully draped it over her legs. "Let me know if you need anything," she said gently. "We'll be checking in with you every half hour." Ella gave a small nod in thanks. It was strange receiving attentive care now, after being ignored just an hour earlier, but she didn't push it away. She accepted it because this time it came from a different place. Not guilt, not obligation, just recognition. Across the aisle, a young man, maybe mid-20s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had watched the earlier incident from a distance. He had stayed silent, but now as Ella reached for the in-flight magazine, he leaned over slightly. "I saw it all," he said in a quiet voice. "What she said, how she treated you. I should have said something. I didn't. I just froze." Ella looked at him. His face was sincere. His hands fidgeted. She could see the discomfort in his shoulders. "You don't owe me anything," she said. He swallowed. "But I owe myself the truth. And the truth is, I stayed quiet because I thought someone else would step in." Ella Asensio. Most people do. He leaned back slowly, his eyes distant now, like someone rethinking their entire role in the world. Behind them, an elderly couple whispered to each other. Their voices were too low to hear, but their glances kept landing on Ella. The husband eventually pulled out a notepad and began writing. He passed the note to Margaret as she walked by. "Ella lo vio solo por un segundo, una oración corta." She deserves a formal apology. All of us saw what happened. It was a simple sentence, but it carried weight because when passengers start putting words on paper, the airline listens. Up in the cockpit, the captain finished writing his report. The document included timestamps, names, and passenger statements. He had never filed a live conduct report in the air before, but this flight was different. As he signed the digital form, a call came through his headset. "We've coordinated with ground security," the voice said. "Her husband will be at the gate with an executive escort. The board has also requested a debrief of the incident," the captain replied calmly. "I'll speak with him personally. I've already submitted my full statement." There was a pause. "Then, we'll also need a formal account from the remaining crew and the passenger herself." The captain nodded to himself. "She's calm. She'll speak when she's ready." Back in business class, the lights dimmed slightly as the cabin entered the late evening phase of the flight. Ella leaned her head back and pulled the blanket a little higher. She wasn't sleeping, Her mind was too alert for that, but she was at peace. For once, no one was rushing her. No one was telling her to move, to change, to be smaller. The attendants checked on her at quiet intervals, but otherwise left her in silence. The kind of silence that didn't come from avoidance, but from respect. She turned her head to look out the window. The stars were visible, faint but steady against the night sky. The moon cast a soft silver light on the wings. Somewhere down below, cities flickered like little patches of fireflies, unaware of the drama unfolding far above them. In her lap, her phone buzzed once, just a brief vibration through the blanket. She reached for it, checked the screen, and saw a single message from gate operations. Message, passenger, escort, and executive team will be waiting at door 2L upon arrival. Please remain seated until approached. Ella's lips curved slightly, not a smile, not satisfaction, but quiet understanding. This was no longer about one flight. This was about what happens when someone is forced to endure humiliation in public and responds with dignity, not rage. This was about an airline being forced to choose between its silence and its standards. And this was about a woman, tired, pregnant, polite, who refused to disappear when someone decided she didn't matter. The lights dimmed further as the plane sailed into the clouds. The hum of the engines remained steady, but the air inside the cabin, it had changed forever. The cabin lights remained dim, casting a soft amber glow over the passengers as the flight entered its final stretch. Most of the cabin had settled into a tired stillness. Some passengers slept, others scrolled quietly through in-flight entertainment. But beneath the surface, the memory of what had happened still stirred in people's minds like ripples on still water. Ella stayed awake, her gaze flicking between the overhead light and the moonlit window beside her. She hadn't moved much in the past hour. Her body was sore, her feet slightly swollen, but she remained calm. She felt the weight of her baby pressing gently against her ribs and placed a protective hand on her stomach. Her phone, still in airplane mode, lay untouched in the seat pocket. She didn't need it now. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion. She had done what was right. She had stayed composed, said the truth, and let others see what they needed to see. And they had a row behind her. The man with the notepad, the same one who had written a note earlier, gently tapped Margaret as she passed by on her routine check. "If there's a record of passenger statements," he said in a low voice, "I'd like to add mine." Margaret looked at him, surprised. "That's very kind, sir." "It's not kindness," the man replied firmly. "It's responsibility. We all watched it happen. Most of us said nothing." "That doesn't sit right with me." She nodded solemnly and made a note on her tablet. "I'll include your name and seat number in the internal report." A few seats across, another woman stirred awake, glanced at Ella, then leaned toward her husband. "That's the one, isn't it?" she whispered. "The one the flight was grounded for?" He nodded slightly. "Yeah, I think so." "She didn't look like trouble," the woman murmured. "She didn't do anything." "That's the point," he said. Margaret made her way back to the galley and entered a log of the conversation she'd had. The internal report was growing longer with each hour of the flight. Passenger feedback, crew statements, timeline markers, unusual activity. Everything was being documented, and this time nothing would be brushed aside with a generic apology. Meanwhile, Ella slowly adjusted in her seat, pulling the blanket higher across her stomach. She glanced down the aisle toward the cockpit where the door remained closed. She imagined her husband on the ground already waiting, not pacing, not anxious, but prepared. He always had a way of showing up exactly when things needed to be said the most, and he would say it better than anyone. The intercom chimed again, and the captain's voice returned, calm and focused. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure your seat belts are fastened. We'll be landing in approximately 25 minutes. Our crew will begin final checks." "Thank you, Ella." "No moyo." She stayed perfectly still, watching as passengers roused from sleep and straightened their seats. The cabin was waking up, but it wasn't the same. Everyone seemed more aware now, more conscious of the people sitting beside them, of what they had seen and heard earlier. Margaret returned one last time to check on Ella. She crouched slightly, lowering her voice. "Gate security has been informed. Your escort will meet you first. They've asked you to remain seated until they arrive." Ella gave a calm nod. I know, Margaret hesitated. I know it's not much, but I want you to know I've logged everything. Every crew member, every passenger who came forward, the company will see it. Ella studied her, and if no one had said anything, Margaret looked down, thoughtful. Then the story would have ended differently. Ella leaned back in her seat, pressing her head gently against the headrest. She was tired, yes, but not broken. Not angry, just done. The baby kicked once more, almost as if sensing they were close. Across the cabin, passengers fumbled with bags, collected jackets, turned off screens, but none of them looked at her with the same dismissiveness they once had. Not after what had unfolded. Now every glance carried a different weight, one of awareness, some even of quiet regret. The hum of the aircraft deepened as it began its descent. The runway lights sparkled in the distance, stretching like a promise of closure across the night. Ella pulled the blanket around her and took one last deep breath before the landing. It was almost over. But for some, the real consequences were just beginning. The aircraft dipped lower, the landscape below becoming clearer through the windows. Clusters of lights tracing roads, neighborhoods, and quiet buildings beneath a velvet sky. Inside the cabin, seatbelts clicked, tray tables snapped shut, and a gentle nervousness settled over everyone. Not the kind that comes from turbulence or a rough landing, but from anticipation. They all knew something else was about to happen. Ella stayed perfectly still, her seat upright, her blanket neatly folded across her lap. Her hands rested on her stomach, fingers loosely intertwined. Her phone remained in airplane mode, untouched. She didn't need to send another message. She knew he was already there. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, followed by a long breath of silence from the passengers as the aircraft slowed. No one clapped. No one cheered. The mood remained quiet, subdued. Then the voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The local time is 8:47 p.m. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until the captain turns off the sign. On behalf of the flight crew, we thank you for your patience and cooperation. The cabin lights flickered to full brightness as the plane taxied slowly toward the gate. Ella stared out the window. The terminal appeared just ahead, but it wasn't the glowing signage or the moving jet bridges she noticed. It was the small group of figures standing at the side of the arrival gate just beyond the glass. Among them was a tall man in a gray suit, posture straight, arms folded, eyes locked on the aircraft. Her husband, and standing beside him, were two senior airline executives, faces stiff, clipped name badges visible even from the cabin. A third figure in uniform stood a step behind, hands clasped, eyes downcast. Security. As the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, people began moving, unbuckling, and reaching for their bags. But no one rushed to stand. Not this time. An announcement followed, firm but respectful. We kindly ask all passengers to remain seated for a moment. A company representative will be boarding shortly to meet with a specific passenger. We appreciate your cooperation. Murmurs spread instantly. Robert Hayes exchanged nervous looks, some whispering guesses, others simply watching, but they all knew who it was for. Ella no se movió. She kept her hands steady in her lap. Margaret approached her row and crouched slightly. They're ready. They'll come to you. Just stay seated until they ask. Ella assentiu una vez. A moment later, the door of the aircraft opened with a firm click, and the jet bridge was locked in place. Two figures stepped inside. The first was the senior security officer, the second her husband. He walked down the aisle calmly, eyes scanning the cabin. There was no anger in his face, only clarity. As he reached her seat, he leaned in and spoke low enough that only she could hear. You okay? She nodded. Yes. He looked into her eyes for another second, then turned to Margaret. Thank you for your handling of the second half of this flight. You'll be included in the report. Margaret gave a slight nod, understanding what wasn't said out loud. Then came the second man, the director of operations. He was well-dressed but tired-looking, with lines around his eyes in a firm tone. Ma'am, he said to Ella, on behalf of the airline, I'd like to formally apologize for what happened to you on this flight. It has been escalated to the board. You will not be required to give a statement tonight unless you wish to, but I do want you to know that your experience is being taken seriously. Ella looked up at him. Her voice was soft, but unshaking. Will anything change because of this? The man didn't flinch. Yes, it already has. She studied his face, deciding whether she believed him. Then she slowly gathered her blanket and reached for her small handbag. Her husband extended a hand, but she didn't need it. She stood slowly on her own. The cabin around her had gone completely silent, not out of shock, but out of attention. Everyone was watching now. Ella didn't meet their eyes. She didn't need to. She walked past row after row, the blanket folded neatly in her arm, the officers and executives clearing the path ahead. Each step was measured even. She wasn't rushed. She wasn't escorted like someone in trouble. She was being acknowledged. As she reached the front of the plane, Ava Thompson gave her a respectful nod from the galley. Ella paused, nodded back, and then stepped off the aircraft. The terminal air was cooler, cleaner. She walked slowly beside her husband, their hands not touching, but in sync. Behind her, the airline officials followed, quiet, serious. Ahead, reporters waited by the far windows. None had been tipped off, but word had gotten out anyway. Someone had leaked that the airline had grounded a flight over a passenger mistreatment. No names had been released yet. Her husband placed his hand gently on her lower back, guiding her away from the growing noise. They didn't stop to give a statement. They didn't look back. Inside the aircraft, passengers began gathering their bags, but none of them spoke with their usual energy. They moved slower, more thoughtful. One woman near the front finally broke the silence. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She just sat there. Another replied, and the whole airline moved. They weren't talking about a delay anymore. They were talking about what it means to be seen. As Ella walked down the private terminal corridor beside her husband, the heels of her shoes echoed softly against the polished floor. She didn't speak. Neither did he. They didn't need to. Their silence said more than any words could at that moment. Behind them, the executives kept their distance, not out of disrespect, but because they knew this wasn't their moment to lead. It was hers. They reached a secure door at the far end of the hallway. A staff member in a navy blazer held it open and nodded without a word. On the other side was a quiet lounge. No passengers, no noise, just space. Ella entered first. Her husband stayed by the door, speaking softly with one of the directors. She moved toward one of the soft leather chairs and slowly sat down, easing the weight off her back. Finally, she allowed herself a full breath. Moments later, the director of ethics and conduct entered. His badge was clipped to a charcoal suit, and his expression was firm, but not defensive. He pulled up a chair and sat across from Ella, folding his hands. "Miss Ramsey," he began, using her last name formally, "you're under no pressure to speak further tonight. We've already received crew statements, the pilot's log, passenger notes, and a full audio recording from the galley." Ella nodded, listening. "But I wanted to offer you a chance if you wish to speak plainly. Just for the record. You don't have to retell anything, just your thoughts. What mattered most to you?" She leaned back slightly, her hand still resting on her belly. "I wasn't shocked," she said after a pause. "Not really. It's not the first time someone's made me feel like I don't belong. It's not even the worst. But it's the first time they got caught in front of people who couldn't look away." The director said nothing, letting her continue. She didn't just refuse to help. Ella agregó, "Ella tomó una decisión en el momento en que me miró. She decided who I was, what I was worth. She decided I was exaggerating or needy or trying to get special treatment just because I asked for something small." Another pause. Her voice remained steady. "And the plane didn't stop because she shouted at me. It stopped because no one else stepped in. And that silence, that's what made this different. It wasn't just her mistake. It was everyone's permission." The director nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "I'll be honest with you," Ella continued. "I didn't want her fired. I didn't even need an apology. What I needed was for someone else to finally see what people like me deal with every day and not brush it off as a misunderstanding." He shifted slightly in his seat. "We're going to use this case to revise several internal protocols. Bias training, crew accountability reports, escalation processes. A lot of what failed today is being addressed." Ella met his eyes. "Make sure that doesn't just mean more paperwork." He smiled faintly. "It won't. It means policy with enforcement, monitoring, not just memorizing. She nodded, satisfied enough to let the conversation settle. He rose, thanked her, and exited the lounge. Her husband walked over and sat beside her. This time he took her hand. "You okay?" he asked gently. Ella looked at him. "I think I will be." They sat there for a while quietly as the movement in the hallway beyond the glass slowed. She could still hear the faint clatter of passengers deboarding in the distance. Some would rush to make connections. Others would go home, carry on with their lives, forget this night in a matter of days. But for a few, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to change how they looked at people when they walked onto a plane, especially those who didn't look like they fit. Ella looked out the window, watching as the crew from the flight filed past toward the shuttle. Ava Thompson glanced through the glass and gave a small wave. Not for attention, but for acknowledgement. Ella lifted her fingers slightly in return. A slow, familiar movement stirred beneath her ribs. The baby was kicking again. She placed her hand over her belly, smiling quietly to herself. "You're already watching the world become something else," she whispered. "Let's make sure it keeps changing." Her husband looked at her, pride shining behind his calm. And in that small, quiet room, away from the noise, away from the crowd, a woman who had once been dismissed for asking for help was now the reason an entire company was rewriting its rules. And that was just the beginning. Outside the glass walls of the lounge, the airport continued to move. Baggage carts rumbled in the distance. PA systems called out connecting flights, and employees walked briskly in bright vests and polished shoes. But inside the quiet room, time felt slower. Still, like something important had just happened, and the world hadn't quite caught up to it yet. Her body was exhausted, but her mind remained sharply aware. There was a calm inside her, not the calm that comes from rest, but the kind that follows a storm that didn't break her. Her husband sat across from her, speaking softly on the phone with the airline's board secretary. His tone was polite but firm, each sentence measured. He wasn't asking for favors. He was setting expectations. "We're not looking for headlines," he said quietly. "We're looking for change. Public, clear, lasting change. You have our full cooperation for now. But if this is handled behind closed doors or delayed into months of internal review, you'll lose far more than one passenger's trust." There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. Then he added, "And no, she will not be making a public statement. This isn't her story to prove. It's yours to repair." He ended the call and turned to Ella. "They're drafting an apology letter," he said. "Board signed. It'll go out within 48 hours. They're also offering to name you in their new bias response training initiative. You'd be the reason it exists." Ella's gaze drifted to the window. "Let them name the change, not me." Her husband tilted his head. "Why?" "Because I wasn't the first," she replied. "I'm just the one they couldn't ignore." Her words hung in the air. There had been others before her, women who asked for help and were laughed at, elderly passengers dismissed for being too slow, immigrants looked at with suspicion, people judged for their appearance instead of their presence. Most had been forgotten the moment they stepped off the plane. She hadn't been ignored because she was louder or more powerful. She had simply refused to vanish. A knock came at the lounge door. A staff member entered holding a small folder. "These were left for you by the director of ethics," the woman said. "He asked me to deliver them personally." Ella took the folder and opened it. Inside was a printed statement, brief but specific. "Effective immediately, the airline has placed crew member Lauren Brooks on unpaid leave pending a formal termination review. As part of our internal reform, a mandatory bystander intervention training will be implemented for all flight staff. This initiative will be named the Ramsey Protocol." Beneath the paragraph was a signature from the airline's CEO. Ella handed the paper to her husband. He read it, then looked up. "They gave it a name after you," he said softly. She shook her head. "They gave it a name so they'd remember what happens when they pretend not to see." She rose from the chair slowly, careful with her steps, stretching the tightness from her legs. She walked to the large glass window and looked out at the runway. Somewhere out there, another plane was taking off. Another crew was boarding. And somewhere on that plane, someone who looked like her or didn't would need kindness, would need help, would need to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, the crew would remember what happened tonight. Not because a powerful man made a call, not because a passenger got angry, but because a pregnant woman asked for help and the world moved around her. Her husband stood beside her, watching her with a calm, quiet admiration. He'd seen her strength before in smaller ways, but tonight the world had seen it too. "You ready to go?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Yeah, I've got everything I need." They stepped toward the exit of the private lounge. The hallway outside was empty now. The commotion from earlier faded into silence. As they walked side by side through the quiet corridor, Ella's footsteps were slow but steady. Her shadow moved beside her, long and unshaken. Not once did she look back. She didn't need to because everything behind her had already changed. Ella stepped out of the lounge into the quieter part of the terminal, where few travelers walked, mostly airport staff and late-arriving passengers. The world outside had resumed its normal pace. Check-in counters buzzing, departure screens blinking with new gate numbers, children pulling on parents' hands, conversations happening without urgency. But for Ella, nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Each step she took now felt grounded in something permanent. Not pain, not victory, but truth. She and her husband walked in silence toward the private elevator that would take them to the lower level where a company car waited. Not the kind of luxury offered to VIPs, but the kind of exit reserved for people whose presence made those in power uncomfortable enough to offer quiet protection. The hallway lights above flickered once, then stabilized. The air was cool and still. Somewhere overhead, another plane lifted into the night. But here on the ground, things were finally settling. At the end of the corridor stood a lone man in a black suit, badge clipped to his belt, radio on his hip. Security. He nodded politely as they approached and opened the elevator doors. As the doors closed behind them, Ella leaned slightly against the wall, her hand once again on her belly. Her husband stood beside her, watching the floor numbers light up one by one. He hadn't asked her again how she felt. He didn't need to. He knew this wasn't the kind of moment you summarize with a word. The elevator stopped and the door slid open to a small underground arrival bay. A black SUV waited at the curb with its headlights on. A driver stood ready, holding the door open. Before stepping in, Ella looked up at the dark concrete ceiling overhead, plain and unmemorable. The kind of space people pass through without noticing. That's what this entire experience had started as. A moment that was supposed to pass unnoticed, but it didn't. She turned to her husband. "Do you think she'll ever realize what she really did?" He looked at her thoughtful. "Maybe, but I don't think this was just about her." Ella nodded, then looked past the car, past the exit ramp, toward the quiet runway, barely visible through a side window. "Do you know what scared me the most?" Her voice was calm, her eyes clear. "I wasn't afraid of her rudeness or even the fact that she refused to help. I was afraid of how normal it felt, how easy it was for her to assume I didn't deserve anything more than dismissal." He said nothing, just listened. That's what people don't understand. Disrespect doesn't always come with raised voices or insults. Sometimes it comes in silence, in a turn back, in a shrug, in the way someone speaks to you like you're a burden before you even speak. She paused. And when no one stands up, when everyone pretends not to see it, it becomes normal. He walked to her side and placed his hand on her back. "Not tonight," he said. "Not anymore." She exhaled slowly, then stepped into the car. He followed. As the vehicle pulled away from the terminal, Ella looked out the window. The lights of the airport stretched behind them, glowing rows of white and yellow. People would board flights tonight, tomorrow, next week. Many of them would walk down the aisle hoping only for peace, respect, a quiet trip from one place to the next. Some of them would ask for help. And thanks to one grounded plane, one firm voice, one woman's refusal to be overlooked, someone in a uniform might pause. They might think twice. They might remember, not because of a lawsuit, not because of a media story, but because of what they saw when no one was yelling and nothing was on fire. And still everything changed. No atrás en suacento. The hum of the car was soft and steady. Her husband reached over and gently took her hand. Outside, the night sky stretched wide and open above them. Inside, she was already writing a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, the world was finally learning how to listen. If this story moved you, give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Coming Dune. The story of Ella, a pregnant woman mistreated on a flight, offers profound life lessons rooted in dignity, accountability, and the power of quiet strength. First, it teaches that respect is non-negotiable, regardless of appearance or status. Ella's calm insistence on her rights forced an airline to confront its failures, showing that standing firm without anger can spark change. Second, silence in the face of injustice enables it. The passenger's initial inaction prolonged Ella's humiliation, underscoring the need to speak up when witnessing wrong. Finally, systemic change begins with individual courage. Ella's refusal to be dismissed led to the Ramsey Protocol, proving one voice can reshape institutions. In today's America, where diversity is celebrated, yet disparities persist, these lessons resonate. Disrespect often hides in subtle dismissals, microaggressions at work, biased service in public spaces, or assumptions about worth based on race, gender, or status. Ella's story mirrors experiences of marginalized groups who face similar slights daily. Applying her example means advocating for ourselves and others, even when it feels uncomfortable, and holding systems accountable through policy, not just apologies. It's about noticing the pregnant woman, the elderly, or the overlooked, and ensuring they're seen. Practically, we can practice empathy in daily interactions, offering help, challenging unfair treatment, or amplifying silenced voices. In workplaces, push for training like the Ramsey Protocol to address bias. In communities, support policies that prioritize equity. Ella's legacy reminds us that change doesn't always require loud protests. Sometimes a single steady voice can ground a plane and shift the world. Let's listen, act, and ensure dignity for all.